For 12 years, I believed my marriage was solid, not cinematic, not wildly romantic, but dependable, respectable. The kind of marriage people pointed to and said, they're doing something right. From the outside, my husband David and I looked like a textbook success story. He was a senior manager at a fast-growing tech company in Northern California. I worked in marketing for a mid-size firm. We owned a townhouse in a quiet, expensive neighborhood. We hosted dinner parties, took one vacation a year, and sent out tasteful holiday cards. I told myself that was enough. But looking back now, I see the cracks were always there. I just learned how to ignore them. Somewhere along the way, so slowly I couldn't name the moment, David stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as part of the scenery. I was useful, presentable, reliable, but no longer essential. It may have started when he got his big promotion 3 years earlier. Suddenly, his job wasn't just a job, it was his identity. Late nights became routine. Business trips appeared on the calendar without discussion. Conversations shrank until they were nothing more than logistical exchanges. Did you call the plumber? I'll be home late. We're having dinner with the Johnsons Saturday. That was the rhythm of our life. I tried to tell myself this was normal, that long marriages simply evolve into something quieter, less emotional, more efficient. I swallowed the loneliness that crept in during evenings spent alone on the couch, listening to the muffled sound of David typing behind the closed door of his home office. I stopped sharing ideas, stopped suggesting plans, stopped asking questions I didn't want answers to. Because every time I tried to talk about something that mattered to me, the response was the same, dismissive, casual, almost amused. Once, years earlier, I mentioned wanting to take a photography class. He laughed, not cruelly, worse, politely. Sarah, you take pictures with your phone. Everyone does. You don't need a class for that. And honestly, when would you even find the time? I laughed too, because that was easier than explaining why it hurt. After that, I learned a quiet lesson. If something didn't serve his life, it didn't deserve space in our marriage. So I made myself smaller. What David never noticed was that shrinking outward didn't mean disappearing inside. Something in me was restless, unused, waiting. About a year and a half before everything fell apart, I was lying awake late one night, scrolling mindlessly through my phone while David slept beside me. An ad popped up, free trial, learn Japanese. I don't know why I clicked it. I'd taken 1 semester of Japanese in college, back when I imagined a life full of possibility. I remembered loving the structure of the language, the precision, the way it made my brain work differently. I assumed I'd forgotten everything. I hadn't. The characters came back first, then the sounds, then the rhythm of sentences. Within weeks, I was practicing every night, quietly, with earbuds in, while David worked late or watched financial news like it was a sport. I didn't tell him. Not because I was hiding something, but because I already knew how he'd react. So Japanese became mine, a secret space where I wasn't a wife or a supporting character or an accessory to someone else's ambition. I studied daily, sometimes obsessively, podcasts, tutors, dramas, books. And without realizing it, I was rebuilding a version of myself he no longer recognized. At the time, I thought it was harmless, just a hobby, a quiet rebellion. I had no idea it would become the most important skill of my life. Because soon, very soon, I would be sitting across from my husband at a candle-lit table, smiling politely, while he said things about me he never thought I'd understand. And once I heard the truth, there would be no going back. If I had known what he was going to say about me in that language, if I had known what secrets he'd reveal when he thought I was invisible, I might have stopped studying that night, but ignorance would have destroyed me far more quietly. What started as curiosity quickly turned into obsession. At first, learning Japanese was just something I did to fill the quiet. 10 minutes here, a lesson there. Something to remind myself I still had a mind that could stretch and grow. But as weeks passed, the language stopped feeling foreign and started feeling familiar, like something I'd misplaced years ago and finally found again. I built my days around it without meaning to. Mornings before work, I reviewed vocabulary over coffee. Evenings, I practiced sentence patterns while David stayed late at the office. On weekends, I told him I was catching up on emails while I sat at the kitchen table, earbuds in, repeating phrases under my breath. The more fluent I became, the more alive I felt. I moved beyond apps and into real conversations. I scheduled online sessions with tutors halfway across the world. I listened to Japanese podcasts during my commute. I watched dramas without subtitles, not to test myself, but because I didn't need them anymore. And slowly, something else happened. I stopped feeling invisible. Every word I learned felt like proof that I wasn't stagnant, that I wasn't just filling time until David came home, that there was a part of me untouched by his indifference. Still, I kept it private. Not because I was afraid he'd forbid it, but because I didn't want to watch something I loved get minimized into something trivial. I had learned that lesson already. There was a safety in secrecy, a quiet power in knowing something he didn't. It wasn't deception, it was preservation. By the 1-year mark, I could follow normal conversation easily. I wasn't perfect, but I understood tone, implication, politeness levels. I knew when someone was being sincere and when they were. That detail would matter later. Around that same time, David changed too, or maybe I finally started noticing. He began speaking with more confidence at home, using buzzwords, dropping casual references to overseas meetings and high-level strategy discussions. He liked reminding people, me included, how important he'd become. Sometimes, he practiced Japanese out loud while packing the living room. He never once asked if I understood. I listened from the hallway, my heart pounding, realizing something unsettling. His Japanese wasn't just functional. It was good, very good. That meant something. It meant he was having conversations I wasn't meant to be part of. Conversations where I didn't exist, except perhaps as a footnote. The realization made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. Not jealousy, not fear. Awareness. Then, one evening in early fall, everything shifted. David came home earlier than usual. He didn't go straight to his office. He didn't check his phone. Instead, he stood in the kitchen watching me cook like he hadn't done in years. "I've got big news," he said, loosening his tie. I turned, surprised. "We're about to close a major partnership with a Japanese firm. Their CEO is flying in next week." I smiled, congratulated him automatically. "And," he continued, "I'm taking him to dinner. You'll be coming with me." That caught my attention. "Me?" He nodded. He specifically asked if I was married. It's cultural, family stability matters. It makes negotiations smoother. So that was my role. He explained it casually, as if it were obvious. I wasn't being invited as a person. I was being included as evidence. "You'll just need to look nice," he added. "Smile, be pleasant." There it was again. The same familiar shrinking feeling. I agreed anyway. As he talked, about the restaurant, about the importance of the meeting, about how much pressure he was under, I noticed something else. Pride. Not excitement, pride. He mentioned he'd be handling most of the conversation in Japanese, that the visiting executive didn't speak much English, that this was one of the reasons he was being considered for an even higher position. I nodded like it was new information. Inside, my pulse raced. He had no idea. No idea that I understood every nuance of the language he thought was exclusively his. No idea that I could hear not just words, but intention. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the conversation over and over. I told myself I was being dramatic, that it was just a dinner, that nothing would happen. But a quiet voice inside me whispered something I couldn't ignore. This is a test. I didn't know of what, or for whom. Only that the skill I'd been nurturing in silence, the one part of my life that still belonged entirely to me, was about to collide with the marriage I'd been trying so hard to preserve. And once it did, there would be no pretending I hadn't heard what I heard. I went asleep that night believing the dinner would be uncomfortable. I didn't yet know it would expose every lie my marriage was built on, or that my husband would destroy everything with words he thought I couldn't understand. The days leading up to the dinner moved strangely, too fast and too slow at the same time. On the surface, life continued as usual. David left early. I went to work. We exchanged brief updates about schedules and groceries like coworkers sharing an apartment. But underneath that routine, something inside me was sharpening. I prepared in silence. Every night after David fell asleep, I reviewed business vocabulary. Not the casual phrases I used with tutors or in dramas, but the formal structures, the careful politeness used in negotiations, the subtle language that softened insults or concealed intent. Japanese isn't just a language, it's a social instrument. What isn't said often matters more than what is. I practiced listening between the lines. I told myself it was just intellectual curiosity, that I wanted to be prepared in case I accidentally caught a word or two. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wanted to hear everything. David never noticed my intensity. He was too busy rehearsing his own role. I overheard him packing the house, practicing phrases aloud, adjusting his tone, perfecting his confidence. He sounded impressive and unfamiliar. By Wednesday, he had decided what I would wear. Something conservative, he said, elegant but not distracting. He pulled a dress from my closet like he was selecting furniture. Navy, long sleeves, modest neckline. Perfect, he said. You'll look exactly right. I swallowed the urge to ask what right meant. Thursday evening arrived with a heavy stillness in the air. I dressed carefully, the way I always did when the goal was not to stand out. As I looked at my reflection, I saw what he wanted me to be: polished, neutral, easy to overlook. I also saw someone he didn't recognize anymore. The restaurant was in San Francisco, sleek and impossibly expensive. The kind of place where reservations were favors and conversations were currency. David used the company account. He always did for places like this. We arrived early. David adjusted his tie twice, checked his reflection in his phone screen, straightened his posture. Just remember, he said casually, don't try to follow the business discussion. If he speaks to you in English, keep it light. We need him focused. I nodded. We were led to a private table. The Japanese executive was already seated, mid-50s, calm, impeccably dressed. He stood to greet us, bowing politely. David returned the gesture, confident but slightly exaggerated. I mirrored them both. Introductions were made in English first. Compliments about the restaurant, polite observations about travel and weather. His English was far better than David had implied. Then, as menus arrived, the conversation shifted naturally into Japanese. David's tone changed instantly. He straightened, his voice deepened, his confidence sharpened. And I understood everything. At first, it was harmless. Market projections, expansion timelines, product compatibility. I listened quietly, smiling at appropriate moments, sipping water, letting them forget I existed. That was the easy part. Then the executive glanced in my direction and asked a question, in Japanese, about my work. David didn't even hesitate. He answered for me. He described my career lightly, dismissively, reduced it to something small, something unimportant, a way to pass time. I kept my expression smooth. Inside, something twisted. The executive nodded politely and moved on. He didn't press. He didn't look at me again. The message was clear. As the meal progressed, I noticed more. David exaggerated his achievements, took ownership of team successes, framed himself as indispensable. It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the truth either. And then the conversation drifted somewhere I hadn't expected. Work-life balance, long hours, sacrifice. The executive spoke thoughtfully about family support, about the pressure of leadership. David laughed. Not warmly, not gratefully. Dismissively. He said something then, something casual, something careless, that made my stomach drop. He talked about me like I wasn't a person, like I was a convenience. I gripped my glass tightly, the coolness grounding me as my pulse thundered in my ears. He wasn't just talking about his marriage. He was defining my worth. And he was doing it freely, comfortably, convinced that I would never know. The executive shifted in his seat. His responses became shorter, more formal. But David didn't notice. He was too busy talking. Too busy revealing things that couldn't be unheard. By the time dessert arrived, I wasn't hungry. I was bracing. Because I could feel it, like the pressure before a storm. He wasn't done yet. I thought hearing him belittle me would be the worst part of the night. I was wrong. What he said next would change my life permanently, and he said it with a smile. By the time the main course arrived, the room felt smaller. The lighting was soft, the kind meant to create intimacy, but all it did was sharpen the tension curling in my chest. I sat perfectly still, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. Years of practice had taught me how to disappear politely. David, on the other hand, was expanding. The more he spoke, the more animated he became. His Japanese flowed effortlessly now, his voice confident, almost indulgent. He gestured lightly with his chopsticks, leaned back in his chair, laughed at his own observations. He was enjoying himself. The executive, Mr. Tanaka, listened carefully. He nodded often, asked thoughtful questions, redirected the conversation when it drifted too far from business. I noticed how measured his responses were, how deliberately neutral. David didn't. At some point, Tanaka mentioned the strain that leadership can put on personal relationships. He spoke about long hours, travel, and the quiet toll ambition takes on family life. David chuckled. That sound, sharp, dismissive, cut through me. He responded quickly, casually, like the topic barely deserved thought. He said he was fortunate, that his home life was simple, predictable, that he didn't have to worry about emotional demands or competing ambitions. Then he said it. He said his wife was content with a simple existence. He said I didn't understand the business world and didn't need to. He said he handled the important matters, finances, decisions, planning, because it was easier that way. I felt my breath hitch, but I didn't move. He spoke like I wasn't sitting right there. Like I was furniture. Tanaka's expression flickered, just for a moment. A tightening around the eyes, a pause too long to be accidental. But David barreled on. He explained, still in Japanese, that having a wife without ambitions made his life easier. That he never had to compromise or explain himself. That I was useful for appearances, for hosting, for stability. He said it worked perfectly for him. My hands were trembling beneath the table. I focused on my breathing, on the weight of the chair, on the faint clink of glassware around us, anything to keep myself grounded. Tanaka responded with a vague sound of acknowledgement. He didn't agree. He didn't challenge him either. Instead, he gently shifted the conversation back to career goals. That's when David crossed another line. He spoke about the future, about promotions, international opportunities, flexibility. He bragged about how carefully he'd positioned himself. And then, with the same casual tone, he mentioned money. He talked about accounts I'd never heard of, about moving assets quietly, about maintaining independence. He said it was smart planning. My heart slammed against my ribs. He spoke openly about separating finances without my knowledge, about preparing for changes that might require freedom from joint decisions. Tanaka went very still. I stared at my plate, forcing myself not to react, my mind racing. This wasn't hypothetical. This wasn't ambition. This was preparation. Then came the final blow. Tanaka asked about stress, how David managed the pressure of his role. David laughed again. He said he had support. He mentioned another woman. He said her name easily, without hesitation, spoke about her intelligence, her ambition, how refreshing it was to be with someone who understood his world. He said he'd been seeing her for months. He said his wife had no idea. I felt something inside me fracture. But still, I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I smiled faintly, the way I'd been trained to do. Tanaka's discomfort was obvious now. He shifted in his seat, redirected the conversation abruptly, returned to neutral topics with professional precision. The mood never recovered. By the time dessert was cleared, the energy at the table had changed completely. David didn't notice. He was too pleased with himself, too confident in his performance. The dinner ended politely. Tanaka bowed to David, then to me. He looked at me directly this time. There was something in his expression, I would later realize, recognition, respect, or perhaps regret. As we walked out into the cool night air, David exhaled with satisfaction. "That went well," he said. "Very well." I nodded. The drive home was quiet. David hummed along to the radio. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur together. At home, he kissed my cheek distractedly and disappeared into his office. I went upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and stood there, alone in the silence. I had heard everything. Every insult. Every betrayal. Every plan. And in that moment, something inside me finally shifted, not into anger, not into grief, but into clarity. I knew exactly what I had to do next. That night, instead of confronting him, I made a phone call that would quietly dismantle his entire world, and he never saw it coming. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed beside David, staring into the dark, listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't dismantled our marriage course by course over an expensive dinner. My mind replayed his words in Japanese, precise, dismissive, unfiltered. He hadn't been angry when he said them. That was the worst part. There was no malice in his tone, just certainty. Certainty that I was small, that I didn't matter enough to be informed, consulted, or respected. By morning, my shock had hardened into something colder. I went through the motions like muscle memory, showered, dressed, drank coffee I couldn't taste. David kissed my cheek on his way out, distracted, already checking his phone. "I'll be late tonight," he said. Of course. The door closed behind him, and the house fell silent. That silence felt different now, heavier, honest. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, replaying the conversation, not emotionally this time, but analytically. I wasn't just hurt. I was informed. I knew about the money, the accounts, the woman, and most importantly, I knew he believed I was incapable of understanding any of it. That belief was my advantage. I didn't call him. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry into a pillow or scream into the empty house. Instead, I called Emma. We hadn't spoken in years, not really. She'd been my closest friend in college before life drifted us apart. She'd become a family law attorney. I'd become whatever I was now. She answered on the second ring. "Sarah," surprise colored her voice, "is everything okay?" "No," I said, and my voice cracked on the single word. "I need help." She didn't interrupt as I told her everything. Not once. I told her about the dinner, about the language, about the accounts, the affair, the way he spoke about me as if I were a prop in his life. She listened quietly, occasionally asking clarifying questions, not emotional ones, practical ones. When I finished, there was a pause. Then she said, "First, breathe." I did. "Second," she continued, "you are not crazy, and you are not powerless." Something in my chest loosened. She explained carefully what I was facing, that hiding assets in anticipation of divorce could be illegal. That infidelity wasn't just personal, it had legal implications. That the casual way he'd spoken about finances suggested a paper trail. "But," she warned, "you can't confront him yet." The word "yet" mattered. "If you do," she said, "he'll hide things better. He already thinks he's smarter than you. Let him keep thinking that." She gave me a plan. A calm, methodical plan. Gather documents, bank statements, tax records, anything I could access, photograph, copy, store everything securely. "Be thorough," she said, "and be patient." When we hung up, I felt something unfamiliar. Control. Over the next few days, I became an actress in my own life. I smiled at the right moments, asked about his meetings, made dinner, listened while he talked about work, about stress, about ambition. Every word he spoke now carried a double meaning. Every lie landed differently. I watched him carefully, not with suspicion but with clarity. He wasn't careful. That surprised me. David trusted his own intelligence too much. His files were organized, his office unlocked, his printer tray full of documents he assumed I'd never read. He had underestimated me completely. The first morning I stayed home, sick, I went into his office after he left. My hands shook as I opened drawers, not from fear, but from the weight of confirmation. There they were. Bank statements I'd never seen, transfers that didn't align with our shared accounts, names of institutions I didn't recognize. I photographed everything. I moved slowly, deliberately, like I was cataloging evidence at a crime scene. Because that's what it felt like. I found emails too, printed ones, careless ones. And then I saw her name. Not just once. Over and over. Plans, compliments, references to a future that didn't include me. One line made my stomach drop. "Once I handle the Sarah situation, we won't have to hide anymore." The Sarah situation. I closed the drawer and sat in his chair, staring at the wall. This wasn't just betrayal. This was erasure. I sent everything to the secure folder Emma had set up for me, labeled files, dates, patterns. By the end of the week, I had stopped shaking. I was focused now. Because I finally understood something important. David didn't see me as a threat. And that was his biggest mistake. For the next 6 weeks, I would live beside my husband like nothing was wrong. while quietly building the case that would cost him his marriage, his reputation, and the future he thought he controlled. The hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence. It wasn't seeing the numbers, the emails, or the proof laid out so clearly that denial became impossible. The hardest part was pretending. For 6 weeks, I lived beside a man I no longer recognized. Or maybe, the man I finally understood. I cooked meals and asked about his day. I laughed at the right moments. I nodded when he complained about work pressure. I listened while he spoke about ambition and stress and sacrifice, never once mentioning the woman who supposedly understood him better than I ever could. At night, I lay beside him, rigid, counting the distance between us in inches and years. He never suspected a thing. Why would he? In his mind, I was still the same woman. The quiet one, the agreeable one, the one who didn't ask questions or challenge narratives. Meanwhile, every spare moment I had was spent documenting. Emma and I met twice a week at her office. She reviewed everything with surgical precision. Bank statements, transfer timelines, email chains, property documents I didn't even know existed. "Your instincts were right," she told me once. "He's been planning this for a while." That knowledge hurt more than the affair. It meant his betrayal wasn't impulsive. It was strategic. We discussed options, divorce filings, financial disclosure laws, possible consequences for his career if certain information surfaced. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Emma asked one afternoon, leaning back in her chair. "Once we move, there's no undoing it." I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was, I had already undone something. The night I stopped being his wife didn't come with shouting or tears. It didn't happen in the kitchen or the bedroom. It happened quietly, sitting alone in my car. I had just left Emma's office after finalizing our timeline, papers drafted, evidence organized, strategy in place. I sat in the parking lot with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. And I realized something. I wasn't scared anymore. The fear had burned itself out, replaced by a steady calm. I wasn't planning revenge. I was choosing myself. That distinction mattered. When I walked into the house that night, David barely looked up from his phone. "Long day?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, "work stuff." He nodded, uninterested. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just clear. I understood then that I didn't owe him a confrontation, or closure, or explanations. I owed myself freedom. Emma filed the divorce papers the following Thursday afternoon. Friday morning, I didn't go to work. Instead, I sat in Emma's conference room, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the clock tick forward. At 9:00 a.m., the evidence package was delivered to David's company's ethics department. At 9:30 a.m., he was served at his office. My phone was off. I didn't want to hear his voice when the world he'd carefully constructed began to collapse. At 11:15, Emma received confirmation. Administrative leave. Investigation opened. Divorce papers served. She looked at me carefully. "How do you feel?" I searched for the answer. "Terrified," I said, "but lighter." That afternoon, David called 47 times. He left messages ranging from confused to furious to pleading. I didn't listen to a single one. Emma did. She documented everything. That night, I stayed in her guest room. She'd already made the bed, left a lamp on, placed a glass of water by the nightstand. We ordered takeout, drank wine, talked about anything except David. For the first time in years, I slept. The next day, I returned to the house, escorted. David looked smaller than I remembered, Rumpled, unshaven, his confidence stripped away. He started talking the moment he saw me. I stopped him with a raised hand. "I heard everything," I said calmly. "Every word at the dinner." His face drained of color. "You don't speak." "I do," I said, fluently. Silence. "I'm not here to argue," I continued. "I'm here to collect my things." He tried to bargain. Apologize. Promise change. But I wasn't listening anymore. Because the woman who would have believed him no longer existed. I packed for 2 hours. When I left, I didn't look back. I thought the worst was over once I walked out that door. I was wrong. What came next would expose just how far David had fallen and how high I was about to rise. Once the papers were served, the pretending stopped, but the consequences had only just begun. For weeks, I had lived in careful stillness, managing my emotions like a secret operation. Now everything was moving fast, too fast. Lawyers were calling. Documents were being requested. Deadlines appeared overnight. David's silence was temporary. When it broke, it was chaotic. His messages shifted tone daily, sometimes hourly. One voicemail was full of confusion, another of anger, another of regret so exaggerated it felt rehearsed. "I don't understand how this happened," he said in one. "We can fix this," he insisted in another. "You've ruined my life," he accused in the next. Emma cataloged everything calmly, professionally. Each message became evidence, not of my cruelty, but of his unraveling. The company investigation moved faster than I expected. David had always believed himself untouchable. Senior leadership, strong performance, international value, but ethics departments don't care about ego. They care about documentation. And we had a lot of it. The offshore transfers raised immediate red flags. The undisclosed accounts violated company policy. The relationship with a subordinate, especially one tied to financial decisions, triggered another layer of scrutiny. David was officially placed on administrative leave within days. He called again. This time I answered. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse, "you didn't have to do this." "I didn't," I replied evenly. "You did, I just stopped protecting you." There was a long pause. "I never thought you'd," he started. "That's the problem," I said quietly. "You never thought about me at all." He asked to meet, to talk, to explain. I declined. Closure wasn't something he was entitled to. The divorce process was slow and procedural. California law demanded patience. But every disclosure chipped away at the illusion he'd built. The hidden properties surfaced. The accounts were traced. Transfers were reversed. Assets were frozen. What he thought was clever planning became evidence of intent. Emma negotiated relentlessly. "Half," she told him through counsel, "or we go to court with everything." He folded. The man who once spoke so confidently about control now feared exposure more than loss. By the time the company investigation concluded, the outcome was unavoidable. Termination. No press release, no public explanation, just a quiet removal from leadership. He found another job eventually, but not at the level he'd expected, not with the authority he once wielded, and not with the future he'd planned. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened to me. I began to feel steady. Not euphoric, not triumphant. Just grounded. I took leave from work and focused on rebuilding. I slept. I exercised. I reconnected with people I'd drifted away from, friends David had subtly discouraged over the years. Including Emma. She became more than my attorney again. She became my anchor. One afternoon, about 2 months into the divorce process, I received a message that made me pause. It was from Tanaka, the executive from the dinner. He had found me on LinkedIn. His message was brief, polite, and carefully worded. He'd heard about my situation. He hoped I was well, and if I was open to it, he'd like to talk. We met for coffee a week later. This time, there were no assumptions. No invisibility. I spoke Japanese from the first sentence. His expression changed instantly. Not surprise. Recognition. He admitted he'd suspected something at the dinner, the way I'd held myself, the way I hadn't reacted. I wondered, he said gently, if you understood more than you were meant to. I smiled. He told me his company was expanding into the US. They needed someone who understood marketing and culture. Someone fluent not just in language, but in nuance. He said my background made me uniquely qualified. The offer came quickly. Senior role. Triple my previous salary. Global scope. I accepted without hesitation. The divorce finalized months later. The settlement was fair, the support temporary, the freedom permanent. I moved into my own apartment, small, quiet, mine. The first night there, I sat on the floor eating takeout, surrounded by unopened boxes. And I laughed. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had survived. And more than that, I had transformed. I thought rebuilding my life was the final chapter. I didn't yet realize that what came next would redefine me in ways I never imagined, and prove that silence can be the most powerful weapon of all. There was no single dramatic moment when David's life fell apart. No shouting headlines, no public disgrace. Just a quiet, irreversible unraveling. By the time the divorce neared its final stages, the man who once spoke so confidently about control and strategy had been reduced to damage control. His career had stalled. His carefully curated image had fractured. And the future he'd been planning, without me, no longer existed. We didn't speak often during those months. When we did, it was through lawyers. The person I saw across conference tables felt like a stranger. Smaller, defensive, stripped of certainty. Once, during a mediation session, he looked at me with something close to disbelief. "You really planned all of this," he said quietly. "You waited." "I didn't plan revenge," I replied. "I planned survival." He had no response to that. The settlement was finalized without trial. The hidden assets were disclosed and divided. Properties I hadn't known existed became line items on legal documents. What he'd tried to secure for himself became evidence against him. He lost more than money. He lost credibility. His new job was quieter, smaller, less visible, the kind of role that required compliance instead of leadership. The woman he'd risked everything for didn't stay. That truth reached me indirectly, through a mutual acquaintance. She moved on quickly, uninterested in a man no longer ascending. I felt no satisfaction in that. Just distance. Meanwhile, my life was expanding. The new position challenged me in ways I hadn't experienced in years. I traveled. I negotiated. I sat in rooms where my voice mattered and was listened to. When I spoke Japanese in meetings, the respect was immediate, not impressed admiration, professional acknowledgement. I belonged there. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Tanaka invited me to dinner. Not business, not negotiation. Reflection. He told me something I hadn't known. At that dinner, he said, I understood more than I let on. He recognized the imbalance, the arrogance, the way David spoke about me. In our culture, he explained, how a person treats those closest to them reveals their character more than any resume. That was why the partnership had been reconsidered. David had believed the dinner was a success. It was. His own words had planted doubt long before the investigation ever began. I thanked Tanaka, not for the job, but for his quiet integrity. Time passed. The divorce finalized. The waiting period ended. The paperwork stopped arriving. One afternoon, 3 years after everything had ended, I received an email from David. It was brief, polite, carefully worded. He said he was sorry, that he'd reflected, that he hoped I was well. He mentioned he'd remarried. I read it once. Then I archived it. Some chapters don't require a response. Years rolled on. I stayed in that role for over a decade, built teams, mentored young professionals, especially women who underestimated their own intelligence because someone else had taught them to. I never remarried. Not out of bitterness. Out of wholeness. I dated occasionally, loved once more deeply, but I never again allowed myself to shrink for someone else's comfort. And I never stopped studying Japanese. What began as a quiet escape became a lifelong companion, a reminder that growth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it happens silently, in the margins of a life you're told is already complete. The night of that dinner still visits me sometimes. Not with pain, with clarity. Because it marked the moment I stopped waiting to be seen and started choosing myself. I thought that was the end of the story. But looking back now, decades later, I realized the real lesson didn't come from betrayal. It came from what silence taught me about power, patience, and knowing my worth. I'm in my 60s now. When people hear that, they often assume the story ends quietly, like everything important already happened long ago. But the truth is, I remember every detail of that turning point with startling clarity, not because it broke me, because it revealed me. The woman I was before that dinner believed endurance was the same as loyalty. That keeping peace meant keeping quiet. That love required minimizing yourself so someone else could feel large. I was wrong. The divorce didn't just free me from a marriage. It freed me from a version of myself that had learned to accept less than she deserved. I spent 15 years in that leadership role after the separation. 15 years of meetings where my opinions shaped outcomes. 15 years of travel that expanded my world instead of shrinking it. 15 years of watching younger professionals, especially women, discover that they didn't have to ask permission to grow. I made friends across continents, built teams that respected nuance, culture, and collaboration. I was valued not because I was agreeable, but because I was capable. And every time I spoke Japanese in a boardroom or negotiation, I smiled inwardly. Because I remembered the woman who learned it in secret. The woman who sat silently at a dinner table while her life detonated. She had no idea what she was becoming. I never remarried. That surprises people. But I never felt incomplete. I loved again, once deeply, honestly, with mutual respect. When that relationship ended, it ended cleanly. No betrayal, no erasure, just two people choosing different paths. That mattered to me. David reached out once, years later. A short email, an apology softened by time and regret. He said he hoped I was happy. I believed he meant it. I didn't reply. Not out of cruelty. Out of closure. Some conversations belong to the past, and reopening them doesn't always heal anything. What stayed with me wasn't anger, it was awareness. Awareness of how easily people underestimate quiet growth. How often intelligence is overlooked when it isn't loud. How dangerous it can be to assume someone isn't listening simply because they aren't speaking. Japanese remained part of my life long after my career ended. I read novels, watched films, occasionally tutored professionals preparing for international work. When they struggled, when they doubted themselves, I told them something I wish I'd learned earlier. Growth doesn't need permission. If you're listening to this and you feel unseen, if your interests are dismissed, your ambitions minimized, your voice quietly edited out of your own life, pay attention. That feeling isn't weakness. It's information. Learn the skill they don't expect you to master. Build the strength they assume you don't have. Gather knowledge quietly if you must, but don't mistake silence for surrender. Because one day, when the moment comes, you'll be ready. And when it does, you won't need revenge. You'll have something far better. Freedom. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't speaking up. It's listening, preparing, and choosing the moment when your voice can no longer be ignored.